The internet is a vast, intricate web of connections, information, and secrets. What most of us see daily is just the surface: social media, news sites, shopping platforms. But beneath that lies the deep web, a place where anonymity reigns and where the darkest corners of humanity often hide. I once ventured into this abyss out of sheer curiosity, but what I found left me scarred forever, a shadow lingering in my thoughts every waking moment. It wasn't just what I saw, it was what followed me out. It all began one late night when I was scrolling through Reddit. I stumbled upon a thread about the deep web and the strange, unexplainable things people had encountered there. Tales of hidden marketplaces, hitman services, and bizarre cult websites piqued my interest. Being young and foolish, I thought it was all an exaggeration. I decided to see for myself. With the help of Tor, a browser specifically designed for accessing the deep web, I began my descent. I knew the risks: viruses, hacking, illegal content, but my curiosity overshadowed my common sense. At first, it was underwhelming. The majority of websites I came across were mundane forums discussing conspiracy theories, marketplaces selling stolen goods, and poorly designed chat rooms filled with cryptic messages. But as I navigated deeper, I stumbled upon a link titled The Grave Watcher. The name alone sent a chill down my spine, but it was the description beneath that hooked me. Only the brave dare see the truth of death. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The page took an unusually long time to load, and for a moment, I considered closing the browser. But then it appeared: a simple black screen with white text in the center. Welcome. Do you wish to see? Below it was a yes button, pulsating faintly. My hand hovered over the mouse, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I clicked. The screen went dark, and a video began to play. The footage was grainy, as if recorded on an old camcorder. It showed a dimly lit room with a single chair in the center. A person was tied to it, their head slumped forward, face obscured by shadows. They were breathing heavily, their chest rising and falling in erratic bursts. A distorted voice, low and guttural, spoke from behind the camera. Do you believe in the soul? Before the person in the chair could respond, the video glitched, the screen flickering violently. When the image stabilized, the person in the chair was screaming. Their mouth was open wide, unnaturally so, as if their jaw had been dislocated. But what terrified me wasn't the scream, it was the eyes. They were pitch black, voids that seemed to stare directly through the screen and into me. Suddenly, the video cut to a series of disjointed clips: a dark forest illuminated by a faint flashlight beam, a dilapidated house with shattered windows, and finally, a close-up of a human eye wide, bloodshot, and filled with terror. The distorted voice returned, now louder, almost mocking. The watcher sees all. And now, so do you. The screen went black again, but this time, it didn't return to the main page. Instead, a new message appeared: leave now, or be seen. My heart was pounding as I closed the browser, unplugged my laptop, and shut it down completely. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a hoax, some twisted art project meant to scare people. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The images were too raw, too real. That night, I struggled to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that person in the chair, their hollow eyes piercing through me. But the worst part was the feeling of being watched. I dismissed it as paranoia at first, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, things started happening. It began with my phone. Random notifications would pop up, messages I hadn't sent. They were simple at first: are you there? Or I see you. I thought it was a prank, maybe malware from the deep web, but then I noticed something chilling. The messages would describe exactly what I was doing at that moment. Drinking water at 2:14 a.m., looking out your window. I stopped using my phone entirely, but it didn't end there. My laptop, even when turned off, would emit faint clicking noises, as if someone was typing. One night, I woke to find my screen glowing, displaying a single sentence: the watcher never leaves. I began noticing shadows where there shouldn't be any, faint whispers in the dead of night. My friends and family thought I was losing my mind. I tried explaining, but how could I describe something I barely understood myself? The final straw came when I found a small envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of me, sitting at my desk, staring at my laptop screen. But the image wasn't from my perspective. It was as if someone had been standing right behind me. I moved out of my apartment that week, left my job, and changed my number. For a while, things seemed to calm down, but the sense of being watched never left. To this day, I can't sit in a room without glancing over my shoulder, can't sleep without the light on. And every so often, when I'm alone and the world is silent, I hear that faint, guttural voice whispering, "The Watcher sees all." There's a place in my hometown that most people pretend doesn't exist. It's an old, crumbling asylum tucked away in the woods, hidden behind decades of overgrowth and silence. Officially, it's called Blackthorn Asylum, but to us locals, it's simply the Forgotten Asylum. The place has a dark history of stories of abuse, neglect, and patients who simply disappeared. But to us, it was all just folklore, a way for parents to keep their kids from wandering into dangerous, unstable ruins. It was the summer after graduation when we finally decided to go. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Mia, and 2 others, Samantha and Ryan. We were a tight-knit group, bonded by years of shared mischief. That night, we gathered at the edge of the woods, armed with flashlights, a few snacks, and our phones to document the whole thing. None of us truly believed in ghosts, but we couldn't resist the thrill of the unknown. The walk to the asylum was longer than expected, the narrow trail winding deeper into the woods. By the time we reached the building, the moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the crumbling structure. Blackthorn was massive, its once grand facade now a decaying mess of ivy, broken windows, and graffiti. The front door was ajar, hanging on rusted hinges, as if it had been waiting for us. The first hour was uneventful. We wandered through dusty hallways, stepping over broken furniture and scattered papers. The air was thick with mildew, and every sound our footsteps, the creak of old wood echoed unnervingly. Most of the rooms were empty, but some still had remnants of their past lives, rusted bed frames, faded patient charts, and even a wheelchair lying on its side. We were laughing about how anticlimactic the whole thing was when Mia found the stairs to the basement. She dared Jake to go down first, and, not wanting to seem scared, he agreed. The rest of us followed, teasing each other with fake ghost noises and dramatic gasps. But the moment we stepped into the basement, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The basement was darker than the rest of the asylum, the only light coming from our flashlights. The smell of damp earth and decay was overpowering. We found a series of small, windowless room cells, really. Each one had a heavy, metal door with a tiny slot at eye level. Inside, the walls were scratched, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Samantha joked about finding crazy people ghosts, but her voice wavered. At the end of the hallway, we found a door that was different from the others. It was thicker, reinforced, and had strange symbols carved into the wood. Unlike the other doors, it wasn't open. It had been padlocked, but the lock was old and rusted. Ryan, ever the troublemaker, found a pipe nearby and smashed the lock open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a single, small room. Inside was a wooden chair, bolted to the floor, with leather straps on the arms and legs. Above it, hanging from the ceiling, was an old, cracked mirror. The room felt wrong, like stepping into the eye of a storm. Jake tried to lighten the mood by sitting in the chair, mimicking an evil laugh, but none of us laughed. That's when we heard it, a faint whisper, so soft we almost didn't notice it. It wasn't coming from any of us. It seemed to echo from the walls, an unintelligible murmuring that sent chills down my spine. Mia grabbed Jake's arm, her face pale. "Let's go," she said, her voice trembling. But before we could leave, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the small space, and the dim beam of our flashlights flickered. Ryan ran to the door, pulling at it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, turning into low, guttural moans. The mirror above the chair began to crack, thin lines snaking across the glass. Then we saw it. A figure appeared in the mirror, not a reflection, but something standing behind us. It was tall, its face obscured by shadow, but its eyes were glowing, a sickly, unnatural yellow. We spun around, but there was nothing there. Yet the mirror showed it moving closer, its long fingers reaching out toward us. Panic set in. We screamed, banged on the door, and shone our flashlights in every direction, but the room seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, so cold our breaths became visible. The figure in the mirror grinned, its teeth sharp and, to many, and then it whispered, "Stay." Jake was the first to react, throwing himself against the door with all his strength. It gave way suddenly, sending him sprawling into the hallway. We didn't hesitate. We ran, tripping over each other in our desperate scramble to escape. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more frantic, until they were deafening. When we burst out of the asylum, the night was eerily silent. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the main road. None of us spoke on the way home. The next day, Jake called me. He sounded shaken, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not over," he said. He told me he'd woken up to find scratches on his arms, like fingernail marks. And then there was the mirror in his bathroom. It had cracked overnight, the lines forming the same symbols we'd seen on the door. One by one, we all experienced strange things. Flickering lights, whispers in empty rooms, and shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. The asylum had left its mark on us, and no matter how far we ran, we couldn't escape it. To this day, I don't know what we unleashed that night. But I know one thing for sure, some places are forgotten for a reason. Widow's Creek is a place everyone in my town knows but avoids. It's a small, winding stream hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by overgrown trees and thick fog most nights. Stories about it have been passed down for years, tales of people who went missing after wandering too close. Locals say the creek is cursed, haunted by something no one can explain. I never believed in those stories. Ghosts, curses, they all seemed like things people made up to scare each other. But that changed one night, the night my friends and I decided to explore Widow's Creek. It was supposed to be a fun adventure. There were 4 of us. Me, my best friend Emily, her boyfriend Mark, and our buddy Sam. We were bored and looking for a thrill. Someone brought up the idea of going to Widow's Creek, and before I knew it, we were packing flashlights and snacks, ready to prove the stories were just myths. The hike to the creek was harder than we expected. The trail was narrow, with roots and rocks tripping us every few steps. The deeper we went into the woods, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. When we finally reached the creek, the air felt heavy, almost electric. The water was dark and still, barely reflecting the moonlight. Emily joked about how creepy it looked, but her voice was strained. We set up near the edge, laughing nervously as we dared each other to get closer to the water. Mark was the first to cross the line. He stepped onto a rock sticking out of the creek and turned to face us. "See, nothing to be scared of," he said, grinning. But as soon as the words left his mouth, something splashed in the water behind him. We all froze, our flashlights darting over the surface. The water rippled, but we couldn't see what caused it. Mark laughed it off, saying it was probably a fish. But then it happened again, louder this time, like something big was moving just beneath the surface. "Come back," Emily said, her voice shaking. Mark hesitated, then jumped back to shore. The moment his feet hit the ground, the air around us grew colder. The water started rippling on its own, even though there was no wind. And then we heard it, a soft, low whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We nodded, too scared to speak. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until we could make out the words. "Why are you here?" Emily screamed, and we all turned to run, but the woods felt different now. The trail we'd followed was gone, replaced by thick, gnarled roots that seemed to twist and move under our feet. The whispers followed us, growing louder with every step. "Stay together," I shouted, but the fog was so thick I could barely see the others. Emily was crying, Mark was yelling for us to keep moving, and Sam was muttering something under his breath, over and over. I tripped and fell, my flashlight rolling out of my hand. When I reached for it, I saw something in the beam of light: feet. Bare, pale feet standing inches from the water's edge. Slowly, I looked up. A woman stood there, her skin gray and her hair dripping wet, as if she'd just climbed out of the creek. Her eyes were black pits, empty and endless. "Leave," she said, her voice like gravel scraping against stone. "This place is not for you." I scrambled to my feet and ran, not looking back. Somehow, I found the others, and together we burst out of the woods, gasping for air. We didn't stop until we were back at my car, trembling and too scared to speak. For weeks after that night, strange things happened to each of us. Emily said she heard whispers in her dreams, calling her back to the creek. Mark swore he saw the woman's reflection in every mirror he passed. Sam stopped talking about the experience altogether, refusing to even say Widow's Creek out loud. As for me, I still wake up some nights with the sound of those whispers in my ears. And when I close my eyes, I see her, the woman by the water, staring at me with those empty, black eyes. I don't know what we disturbed that night, but one thing is clear. Widow's Creek isn't just a story, it's a warning. There's a stretch of forest on the outskirts of my town that no one dares to enter after sunset. It's called Hollow Pines, and the stories about it have been around for generations. People talk about seeing strange lights deep in the trees or hearing voices calling their names. The most chilling legend, though, is about the shadow, a tall, faceless figure said to haunt the woods, following anyone who ventures too far inside. I never gave those stories much thought. They were just tales parents told their kids to keep them from wandering too far. But last fall, I learned the truth about Hollow Pines the hard way. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. My friends and I had been planning it for weeks, a last hurrah before winter set in. There were 4 of us: me, my best friend Rachel, her cousin Ben, and our friend Alex. We weren't planning to camp deep in the woods, just far enough to feel like we were getting away from everything. We arrived in the late afternoon, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees. The woods were quiet, almost peaceful. We set up our tents near a clearing and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and telling jokes. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we'd forgotten all about the stories of the shadow. It wasn't until later, when the fire was dying down, that we heard a soft rustling in the trees. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but then Alex pointed out something strange. The sound wasn't coming from the treetops where the wind might blow. It was coming from the ground, from the bushes surrounding our campsite. Probably just an animal, Ben said, trying to sound casual. But his voice was shaky, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. We decided to ignore it, brushing it off as deer or raccoons. But the rustling didn't stop. It circled us, moving from one side of the clearing to the other, as if something or someone was watching us. Rachel suggested we pack up and leave, but Alex laughed and called her paranoid. "There's nothing out there," he said, "just your imagination." Then we saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the firelight. It was tall, unnaturally so, and completely still. Its body was like a shadow, black and featureless, blending into the darkness around it. "Who's there?" Ben called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. Without thinking, Alex grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the figure. The beam hit empty air. The figure wasn't there anymore. We all froze, staring at the spot where it had been. "Did you see that?" Rachel whispered. We nodded, too scared to speak. Suddenly, the rustling started again, louder this time, coming from every direction. The shadows around us seemed to stretch and move, reaching toward the light of the fire. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely audible. We scrambled to gather our things, but the firelight flickered, dimming as if something was smothering it. The shadows grew darker, closing in around us. Then we heard a low, guttural sound, like a growl, echoing through the trees. We ran. We didn't care about the tents or the supplies. We just ran, stumbling over roots and branches, not daring to look back. The growling followed us, growing louder with every step, until it felt like it was right behind us. When we finally burst out of the woods and onto the road, the sound stopped. We collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, too terrified to speak. The next morning, we went back to retrieve our gear. The campsite was untouched, as if we had never been there, but the strangest part was the fire pit. The ashes had been arranged into a perfect circle, with strange symbols carved into the dirt around it. Since that night, none of us have been the same. Rachel refuses to talk about it. Ben moved out of town entirely. And Alex, the one who mocked the stories, hasn't slept a full night since. As for me, I can't go near the woods without feeling that same heavy, suffocating presence. The shadow is real. It's out there, waiting in the dark, and I'll never forget the way it felt watching us, even when we couldn't see it. There's a lake about 20 miles from my house that everyone calls Whispering Lake. It's beautiful during the day, with clear water and a quiet shoreline surrounded by tall pines. But at night, no one dares to go near it. The locals say the lake whispers, and anyone who listens too long goes mad, or worse disappears. I didn't want to go. The stories I'd heard growing up always gave me chills. But Tyler was relentless, and eventually, I gave in. He convinced two of our friends, Claire and Josh, to come along. And one warm Saturday evening, we headed out. We reached the lake just before sunset. The water was still, reflecting the fiery orange sky like a mirror. It was eerily quiet, no birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Tyler joked about how peaceful it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We set up near the shore and built a small fire. For the first hour or so, everything was fine. We laughed, told stories, and tried to scare each other with tales about the lake. Tyler even dared Josh to wade into the water, but Josh just rolled his eyes. "I'm not falling for that," he said. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder. The wind picked up, sending ripples across the water. That's when we heard the faint sound of whispers. At first, it was so soft we thought we were imagining it. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder, though we couldn't make out any words. They seemed to come from the lake itself, echoing across the surface like the wind was carrying them. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Josh said, standing up and looking toward the water. "It's probably the wind," but it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like voices, dozens of them, maybe more, all speaking at once. Tyler, always the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and walked closer to the shore. "It's nothing," he said, shining the beam across the water. The whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again. Tyler laughed nervously and turned back to us. "See, it's just in your heads." A loud splash cut him off. We all jumped, our eyes snapping back to the lake. The water was rippling violently, but there was no sign of what had caused it. Tyler froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Then we saw it. A figure was standing in the water, just a few feet from the shore. It looked human but wasn't. Its skin was pale and slick, like it had been submerged for far too long. Its eyes were wide and empty, and its mouth hung open, as if it were screaming silently. "Run," Claire whispered, grabbing my arm. But before we could move, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. They weren't just coming from the lake anymore, they were all around us, surrounding us. The figure in the water took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Tyler stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. "What the hell is that?" he shouted. None of us answered. We were too scared to speak, too frozen to move. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping until they became one clear voice. "Join us." That broke us. We ran, tripping over rocks and roots as we scrambled away from the lake. The whispers followed us, echoing in our ears even as we reached the car and sped away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in the water, its empty eyes staring right at me. Tyler called me the next morning, his voice shaky. He said he'd been having nightmares, dreams of drowning, of hands pulling him under the surface. Claire and Josh experienced the same thing. We stopped talking about the lake, too afraid of what might happen if we brought it up, but the nightmares didn't stop. Even now, months later, I still wake up gasping for air, the sound of those whispers echoing in my head. I don't know what we saw that night or what it wanted from us. But I do know one thing, Whispering Lake is cursed. And if you ever hear it calling, don't listen. Don't go near it, because once you do, it never lets you go.